I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and at long last, this is the Skoda Scala, a car that was supposed to launch in Australia almost a year ago, but that was deferred due to a couple of gremlins with the first batch of vehicles that arrived in the country. Skoda have now sorted all of those things, and so the launch of the Scala, which was held back, has now been given the go-ahead, and we've got a launch edition to test today. Now, this completely tricked up Scala 110 TSI is 36 grand drive away, which isn't cheap. But you can get into one of these cars for as low as 27 grand drive away if you want the manual transmission. And you can still get a manual with this car, even with some decent specifications and the ability to add options. Unlike a lot of rivals, Skoda doesn't force you to have just the absolute BOGO specification if you want to change your own gears, which is kind of cool. Now, I reckon the Scala looks good, it's a good size. Skoda have shied away from having a direct rival to the Volkswagen Golf for quite a long time. They've always preferred to have a smaller hatchback and then the well-known Octavia sedan or liftback and station wagon kind of straddling both sides of the Golf. But the Scala sits right alongside the Golf in terms of dimensions. Now, even though underneath this vehicle actually rides on the MQB A0 platform that has more in common with the Volkswagen Polo. Now, inside the cabin, we see Skoda's new interior design language. Now, we got an idea of this on the Kamiq SUV that we reviewed recently and thought actually was a pretty good car. This is the first time we've seen it in a passenger car, however, and it reflects what will be on the new Octavia, which is going to come to Australia later in 2021. And once again, Skoda, I think, have done a good job in here. This is a clean and minimal interior that still gives you controls for most things that you'd want, with a couple of exceptions. We have this 9.2-inch touchscreen here, which is really bright and really crisp, and we do have shortcut keys up the left and the right. They are touch sensitive, they're no longer physical keys, and there's not a scroll wheel for the volume, which is one thing I always thought was cool. That said, I love how Skoda do volume on the steering wheel with a roller rather than buttons. That works really, really well. Speaking of that steering wheel, Skoda Australia always equip their cars with a nice wheel, and the Scala is no exception. We've got the perforations around the side, flat bottom, paddle shifters as well. Feels really good in the hand, really tactile, and the shortcuts all work as you would expect. You then look forward at a virtual cockpit, digital gauges, you can put a full map there. They have Skoda green touches in them compared to the other brands of the Volkswagen Group, and that technology continues to be pretty much a segment leader. We're sitting on comfortable seats. We've got a nice mix of leather and sort of suede or faux suede in this car. The seats themselves are a good shape. They're not too tight, not too wide. I think a good mix of shapes and sizes will fit. We have electric adjustment in the driver's seat over here. We've got seat heating. Remember, this is the launch edition, so it's got pretty much every feature you can get on the Scala, save for a couple. Now, what I meant when I said there are buttons for most things you'd want, with some exceptions, I meant the fan control. Bizarrely, Skoda have decided that fan control should be kept in the touchscreen, same as on the Kamiq. We have physical controls for the temperature, but if you want to change the fan, you've got to press a button here and then tap away at the touchscreen. And that is just totally daft, and hopefully that is reversed at some point soon. Now, the materials used in the cabin of the Scala are generally quite good. I've mentioned the nice steering wheel, we've got a leather shifter as well, but then we have soft materials up here on the dash, soft materials on the doors, these inserts here. The scratchy plastics are mainly confined to down here where your leg rests, and this rock hard door grab that the Volkswagen Group seems to like putting on their less expensive cars, but for something that you have to hold all the time when you're opening and shutting the door from inside, it's something that I wish was made of a nicer material. In between the seats we have an armrest, though it's not fully adjustable. You can bring it out, but you can't adjust it for height. First world problem, I know, but it just sort of means that for my arm it ends up sort of sitting down like this. The Golf and also a lot of other Skodas let you put this at the height that you want it to be. Now we've got 2.5 sort of small cup holders between the seats. They're certainly not enormous. We've got wireless charging head of the shifter. That's smart because it actually has guides to keep your phone on the induction pad and not slip off, which is cool. We've got 2 USB-C ports here. We've got big door bins, though they are not flock lined, instead they're quite scratchy. That being said, up front, the Scala is pretty salubrious, pretty clean design. Let's have a look in the back seat. The door opening is pretty wide. Of course, you step down into the Scala because this is not an SUV. Good reassuring thunk in the door, and space on offer is decent. Skoda really know how to package a vehicle well with plenty of room, and this is no exception. So for myself, it's 6 foot, got plenty of headroom, legroom's good behind my own driving position, tow room's also fine. You could get someone in the middle if you had to, but there is quite a hump in the floor, so I think keeping it at 4 adults would be the smart thing to do. Now, amenities back here are a mixed bag. We've got no armrest between the seats, even at this price, which is a bit crazy, I reckon. But we do have air vents, that's good to see. We've actually got 2-stage seat heating for both of the outboard seats here in the back of the Scala. That's pretty rare in the small car segment. The materials do switch back to scratchy here, but we still have a pad on the door armrest. And we've got pockets in the back of both front seats and decent sized bottle holders. So mixed bag. Definitely the lack of a center armrest is a bit of a shame though if you're going to be taking 4 people on a longer trip. Heading around the back of the Skoda Scala, I really like what they've done with the aesthetic of this car. They've carried over some of the good parts of the previous Rapid Spaceback, like this black insert here. It's also a bit Volvo C30-esque. The Skoda badging across the back looks pretty cool, like this blue color as well. And then we actually have a power tailgate on the Launch Edition, which is quite generous. Now, as we've covered in several of our videos before, Skoda love a net in the boot. Certainly not giving anything any chance to roll around and rattle while you're driving this car. You've got nets here, 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 4 nets in fact, plus cubbies off to the left and right, plus really sturdy hooks, 4 of them throughout the boot. So this really is a study in how to maximize the practicality of a hatchback. Then we've got a button to close that electric tailgate, which operates really promptly. So we can jump into the driver's seat and see what the Scala is like on the road. So what's the new Skoda Scala like to drive now that it's finally here? Well, it's interesting. You know, this is a really impressive little car that gives you a lot of the best stuff about a Volkswagen Group small car, but a more attractive price tag. But I mean, if you're currently in a Skoda, you'll know that's exactly what this brand is all about. And so it goes for the Scala. At present, there's just one engine offered in this car. It's a 1.5 litre turbocharged petrol 4-cylinder. That's one of the Volkswagen Group's newer small displacement engines, but it produces a very familiar amount of power and torque if you're currently in a VW Group small car, and that's 110 kilowatts of power and 250 Newton meters of torque. And as we found with just about every Volkswagen Golf that has run this amount of power and torque over the last many years, it's a great, flexible, impressive little powertrain that's had a nice update in 1.5 litre form that's basically just made it a little bit more efficient again. 250 Newton meters of torque is plenty in a car like this that doesn't weigh particularly much, and the fact that it's all available from just above idle means that the Scala has really good flexibility and muscularity, either nipping about town, jumping into gaps in traffic, or on country roads on the highway to give you a bit of confidence with overtaking another car. And compared to something like a Mazda 3 or Hyundai i30, the non-turbo models, or the Toyota Corolla, the Scala just feels like it has more grunt, it's more sort of raring to go, feels like a bigger displacement engine, and that's all really good stuff. Now, there isn't the equivalent of something like a GTI at this point for the Scala, or an RS I should say, in Skoda parlance. There is a Monte Carlo version which has a sports suspension, but it has the same engine, the same amount of power and torque, so it's more sports styling and a sports suspension. The car I'm in, the Launch Edition, is a little more elegantly styled. It has some chrome detailing outside. It has 18-inch aerodynamic wheels, which actually look quite cool. I think this blue works well for the Scala, come to think of it. But it does mean that because we're not on the sports suspension, the Scala Launch Edition actually rides pretty well. Not quite as well as a Golf, and that's because there's a fundamental difference in the platform underneath the two cars, and that's that vehicles like the Golf, the Tiguan, the Audi A3, they're on the fully fledged Volkswagen MQB platform, whereas the Scala joins the Skoda Kamiq, the Volkswagen Polo, the Audi A1 on the slightly cheaper MQB A0 variation of that platform. And the main difference is that the rear suspension is torsion beam rather than independent. There are some other bits and bobs that are different. I would say the Scala is probably the most refined vehicle I've driven on MQB A0. Most of the time you could be tricked into thinking that you were in a Golf. It's just that there's a little more noise in the cabin, and the way that it rides over bumps at the rear end is less refined than a Golf or than an Audi A3. Of course, the Scala is a little cheaper than those cars, though in launch edition form, it is 36 grand drive away, which is somewhere between a Golf Comfort Line and a Golf Highline in the outgoing Mark 7.5 shape. So it's not super cheap. And I do think that the way the Scala can thump and bump a little bit from the rear end in town is a bit unbecoming, and I do wish it was on the fully fledged MQB platform like the Octavia, the next Octavia, and the outgoing car, which should be a little more refined again. But that said, for what it is, it's perfectly good, and it's still probably in the upper third of the class for refinement. And of course, vehicles like the Peugeot 308 and the Mazda 3 are both on torsion beam rear ends, and they're okay as well. Otherwise, refinement is decent in the Scala. Visibility out is really impressive, and the handling is good too. The steering is light, pretty assisted. It does weight up as the car builds speed, but the speed of the steering is good. So the car turns in crisply and quickly from the inputs that you feed through this quite attractive and comfortable steering wheel. The body feels poised. The suspension is good in the launch edition. I haven't driven the Monte Carlo yet, so I can't comment quite at this point on what that does to the sportiness of the car, but I mean, it's not like the launch edition struggles. It turns in really well, actually, and you can feel a little bit of movement at the rear end as well. It's quite a balanced car, not as sophisticated in the corners as a Golf, where the multi-link independent rear suspension can help out, but the Scala is certainly quite decent. Also, there are a few other little touches to the Scala that make it good to drive. I mean, it has really good infotainment. It's got that great combination of wireless CarPlay, a digital cockpit, and wireless charging, and a good stereo, so you're pretty much right at ease. Ergonomically, it's good. The seat's comfortable. We've got 4-way lumbar, so you can really get that back support into a comfortable position. However, that adjustable armrest, or lacking in adjustment, is a slight bugbear. Now, a word on safety. The Scala is pretty good, particularly in launch edition form. We've got AEB forwards and also reversing AEB. We've got lane keep assist with lane centering. We've got blind spot monitoring. We've got rear cross traffic alert. So on the whole, the Scala is kitted out pretty well. So that's a detailed look at the new Skoda Scala, a hatchback that you'd have to put on your list if you're looking for a vehicle like the Mazda 3, Ford Focus, Volkswagen Golf, or Toyota Corolla. This is another really interesting option with a distinctive look, plenty of features, and several models that let you kind of pick and choose how much kit you want and how much you want to spend. And of course, the availability of niche selections like a manual with quite a few options on it gives the Scala something of an edge if you're part of that crowd. Of course, most people want an auto, and the Scala can satisfy across the entire range, but it's just nice to know that there's still a bit of choice available through this brand. Now, let me know your thoughts on the Scala down below the video. Have you picked up one of these cars? Are you planning on it? Are you considering something else? While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.